This episode of The Young Turks is brought to you by Audible.com.
John Edwards has been indicted, and he has pled not guilty to charges he used campaign funds to cover up an extramarital affair. John Edwards will admit to taking the money, but say that it wasn't campaign funds. The prosecution is alleging that the $925,000 he collected from two wealthy donors was part of his campaign because it was part of the effort to cover up the affair, which enabled his campaign to go on. That seems sort of undeniable. Edwards will argue that it wasn't using campaign money, that was just given to him to cover up the affair, to keep it concealed from his wife, and had nothing to do with the campaign. That part of the case, totally interesting. I look forward to seeing how that gets resolved. My hunch is, that's a hunch based on reading and just common sense, is that it'll get resolved with some sort of penalty and probation, maybe giving up his law license and a fine. Hard to believe it goes to court. If it does go to court, totally fascinating about whether that was the use of campaign funds or friends of John Edwards giving him money to cover up an affair, which wouldn't be a crime. But obviously, it did enable his campaign to go on, which would make it illegal if it were the campaign funds. He faces 6 counts, at least 5 of them punishable by 5 years in prison and $250,000 fine. At the very least, he faces $1.5 million in fines and at least 25 years in prison, maximum maybe 30 years in prison. I can't tell whether there's a 5-year max on one of these charges. It could be 30 years and $1.5 million. It's at least 25 years and $1.5 million. That's for the max on each one. He would never get that even if he were convicted. So serious charges facing John Edwards, and we'll see how that resolves itself. The Associated Press had a brief story on it, a brief video story on it. There are, of course, many print stories on it. And by the way, I think I mentioned John Edwards has pled not guilty. He said he's guilty of terrible judgment. He did terrible things, but he didn't break the law. So the AP ran this story, and it's funny because it sort of, in the story, goes over John Edwards' excuses. And when this is your defense, you know you're in a bad way. So here's the brief Associated Press story on John Edwards today.
An indictment for John Edwards, a former rising star of the Democratic Party and the vice presidential nominee in 2004. The grand jury action wraps up a 2-year federal investigation into money used to cover up an extramarital affair during the 2008 presidential election. Edwards' donors gave hundreds of thousands of dollars to keep his mistress in hiding. Dollars federal officials say should have been reported by his campaign fund because they helped in his bid for the Democratic nomination. Lawyers for Edwards say the funds were gifts from friends trying to keep the affair a secret from his wife, Elizabeth. She died of cancer in December. His lawyers say the investigation is a waste of resources, saying he did not violate the law. Edwards could lose his law license out of all this, ending his hopes of working as an attorney for the poor.
So your defense is, no. It was just money from my friends to keep the affair from my wife, who was dying of cancer. I don't want to go to court with that defense. You're not going to appeal to a jury. And then he could lose his law license, which will hurt efforts in his hopes to continue to work in the law for the poor. But anything this guy says, you roll your eyes at now. You're like, John Edwards, really? Work for the poor? Like, hey, Jesus, can we run the story again without sound, just a little bit? Because, the guy is so disingenuous now. Everything he does, I mean, I'm sure he'd work for the poor, but I wouldn't even believe anything about it. Like, early on, when you see him, walking the campaign line and that smile he gives, it's so, that smile's fake. Then this here, he's there, he's walking to people, and he's got this smile. He's like, hey, how you doing? No, you're a creep. Everything about you is fake. Everything about that guy is creepy. I told the story before. We can get out of the video now. Look at every smile he has. It's loathsome. Terrible things happen to him. That doesn't excuse his total sliminess. And it's not the affair that's slimy. It's everything about him. The affair is, of course, slimy, but guys engage in that behavior. That in and of itself isn't the slimy part. Everything about the guy is oily and disgusting.
If you don't feel like reading a book and you want to listen to it, all you got to do is go to Audible.com and you can download a book onto your iPod or MP3 player. In fact, just the other day, I was listening to 1984, my favorite book. And they have over 75,000 titles to choose from. So you can get a free audiobook if you go to audiblepodcast.com/TYT.